Welcome back, everyone. So here is the website that we want to use in order to get our list of users. The website will display all of this as JSON, which is pretty much just objects of users with certain attributes on them. So there's an ID, there's a name, there's a username, there's email, there's address, and then there's some other extra information. What we really care about for now is just that there's a name and there's an ID. We need the name to display, and we need the ID because it is the key, if you remember. So what we're going to do is we are going to make a request to this website, which will give us back this array of JSON objects. So very easy. If you want this, it's actually going to be in your resource folder, so it's very easy to access. And what I want you to do is I want you to copy this. And then what we need to do now is figure out how to bring this array into our React application. So let's go back to our application. And let's think about a couple things that we need to do before we even start coding it. First off, what we need to do is think about where we're going to leverage the actual array once we get it inside our component. We've actually already thought about this with our monsters array. So what we want to do is we want to update the state of monsters to the array of users once we get them from the API. Here we have some hard-coded values, but in reality, I actually don't want that. Because when you think about it, why would I want to use any hard-coded values at all? I just want to use what values come from the API. My application should not have to worry about what that data looks like. Or not what it looks like, but whether or not I get how much data. That's not something our application should be largely concerned with. Of course, there are certain things like there are edge cases where if it's empty, do you want to display some kind of message that tells the user that there are no users that have been fetched? Perhaps, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the initial state of this monsters array. If you think about it, if you have an application that makes a request for a bunch of users, if you, let's say, fail in the middle of that API request, let's say your network cuts off or there's some corrupted data or something that is not related to our application, what would you want to do? What would it matter for a user to see? The user should not see anything then. They should just see the fact that there is an empty array, meaning that nothing should display then because nothing was properly fetched. That is the typical behavior of most applications. So in this case, with our state, we want to think about what's known as the empty case or the null case. So what happens when you have an initialized state or when you have a state that has nothing in it? So I'm talking about these state variables, of course. A monsters here is a list of users. So what's an empty version of that? Well, it's an empty list or an empty array. So we want to initialize these values as empty. Once this is empty, now what I want to do is I want to actually get that list of users. And the way I'm going to do that is I need to think, when do I get the list? How do I get the list? Where do I put the list? We already talked about where. It's going to be in our state. But how do I get the list? This is actually where React is going to give us these things known as lifecycle methods. So when you think about a component, I've always mentioned that a component's key thing in React is just figuring out when it renders and when it re-renders. So if our monsters array is empty, when we get the new list of array from our API, we want to update the state object and therefore we want to re-render this component. But when do we want to get that information? We want to get it the moment the app is actually mounted or the moment it's rendered by React, because we want to display the users as soon as possible. In order to do that, we leverage lifecycle methods on this component class that React has given us. And these different methods are listed here. You'll see in my dropdown. There's a bunch of them, but the most important one is really componentDidMount and componentDidUpdate. And probably also component will unmount, but we'll talk about these a little later. We'll focus on componentDidMount. So componentDidMount is a method that you have access to, and inside you want to write your code. And whatever you write here will get run whenever the component mounts. Mounting is the first time a component gets placed onto the DOM. So the first time React renders a component onto the page, that is mounting. It only happens once throughout a component's life. The only time when a component might remount is if it's been unmounted, meaning it's been completely removed from the DOM. And you could almost argue that it's a different component. It might be the same app component or the same component we're using, but it's a new instance of it. So we'll talk more about that as well as we start building out a more complex application. But for now, just understand that the moment your component gets placed onto the DOM is when you want to make an API request for something like users, because that's when you want to get that information so we can display it as soon as possible. So remember, if you need to make an API request so that your component can have the appropriate data it needs in order to render the appropriate things, that's when you want to put it in componentDidMount. So inside of componentDidMount, how do we actually fetch from that API? Well, we're going to use the native fetch. And native fetch, what we do is we give it the URL that we need in order to get that JSON. So here, I'm going to paste that in. Again, you'll find that in your resources folder. Once we fetch this, this is going to be a promise. And a promise is something that is asynchronous in JavaScript. It's essentially a promise that eventually I'm going to have a value. We can talk more about promises in a video in the appendix, where if you're not really familiar with it, it's a good time to watch that after this video so that you can get a deeper understanding. But all you need to know is that what's going to happen is JavaScript is going to fetch what data it can from here. If it succeeds, it's going to come back, and then we can call .then on that value, meaning that now we have a response back from that API request. And this, we want to pass a callback, where the argument is the response itself. So the response that they give us, let's take a quick look at it. So I want you to see what we're going to get. We're going to go to our application. We're going to open up our console. And again, it's empty because you remember I took out all the monsters, so there's nothing in our initial state. But here we got our response back. And inside you see it's just this object, and it has a lot of stuff in it. There's headers, and there's like the status of whether or not it was successful, which it was. There's the URL in which we fetched it from. But primarily what we want is we want this in a JSON format. So what we're going to say is that, okay, I want you to return from this .then this response.json. So I'm converting this over into JSON. And this is what is being returned from this .then. Every .then that returns a value is going to return another promise that has been resolved. So here I can actually say .then again, and what I have now is the users. And let's just quickly console.log this as well. So remember, whatever got returned from response.json is going to get passed to this users as the argument of our callback. So if I save this, I come here, there we see it. If I just refresh just so you're familiar, you'll see that this is the array of the users that we got from JSON placeholder. It's exactly what we're expecting. So now that we have this, let's actually get this in our state, which we can do using setState, as we've done before. So let's get rid of this console log, and instead what we're going to say is this.setState. And here you can either pass it the object where monsters points to users, or you can use the function method. So I'm going to use the function method, and I'm going to return back an object where monsters now points to users. And the reason why I want to use this function method is just so that I can also pass it the callback when this setState is finished, just so that I can make sure that my state has the correct value. So now if we go back to our code, what we see is that we do indeed have all of our users in here. Let me refresh, and we also see that we are logging out our new state with the appropriate monsters with the appropriate values. So everything here is working. And the key thing I want you to focus on, and what we learned, was that whenever we have a component, a class component specifically, that needs to leverage some kind of API call in order to get data that it needs in order to display the appropriate UI, you want to put that inside of your componentDidMount lifecycle method. Now, there are definitely more lifecycle methods that we'll cover in later lessons. For now, though, I just want you to focus on componentDidMount and mounting of the component. In the next video, I'm going to go a little deeper into these three methods that we've seen, which is the constructor, componentDidMount, and the render method, because there is an order here that is important when it comes to how this component is getting added and React determining when to run the code inside each of these. So in the next video, we'll cover that so that you can understand deeper how a class component works. See you in the next video.